Franz Joseph Haydn by Kevin, Annie, and Dylan. Franz Joseph Haydn was an Austrian composer who was one of the most important figures in the development of the classical style of music during the 18th century. Born into a simple family, Haydn was invited to enter the service of Prince Paul Antal Esterhazy. The Esterhazys were one of the wealthiest and most influential families of the Austrian Empire. His employment by the noble family proved to be decisive for his career, and he remained in their service until his death. He was affectionately called Papa by fellow musicians because he is known as the father of the symphony. He composed the German national anthem. He's a very mature composer and by no means is set in his own ways. He's very flexible and receptive to new ideas. Haydn even stated that Beethoven will one day be considered one of Europe's greatest composers, and I shall be proud to be called his teacher. His legacy lives in the reinvention of the symphony, writing the first string quartets, and establishing the genre of symphony into its modern form.
All right, so now I'm going to tell you about Haydn's impact on classical music. So to begin, he played a key part in the development of the classical symphony and the string quartet. And the string quartet was a compositional technique that is composed of 4 different musical voices, including the soprano, which is like a violin, alto, which is like a second violin, tenor, which is a viola, and bass, which is often a cello. And it is considered a very pure technique because of the way that the different instruments come together. He was often regarded as the father of symphony because he wrote 104 symphonies and 84 string quartets. And his music was known for its lightheartedness and humor. And he also laid out an outline for future composers. He created a new classical style that introduced double variation. And double variation is a technique used in composition where the tone alternates between major and minor themes. One of his greatest contributions is thematic and motivic movements within his compositions. This is where there are full movements throughout the song based on like a specific point in the song. And we see how this has influenced other people as we see later composers like Beethoven in his piece, which is called Symphony No. 5 in C minor, which is one of his most famous ones. It displays double variation throughout. He also created what is known as multi-stage variants. And multi-stage variants is where the main theme is repeated in multiple different forms. And is sort of repeated and sequenced throughout the piece in a way that makes it all seem unified. And it is various different harmonies that all link together. And a famous piece that he actually produced is called Keyboard Sonata No. 4 in G major, which we will play later.
So now we're going to talk about Haydn's relationship with Mozart. So the two met in Vienna around Christmas time of 1783. But as we know, Mozart was a prodigy, so he definitely did not need mentoring by anyone. And it is noted that there was a complete and total absence of professional jealousy between the two composers, especially on Haydn's end, since we learned yesterday in class that he wrote that Mozart had surpassed him and that Mozart was for sure the better composer. But through the 1780s in Vienna, together they played in impromptu quartets. So Haydn played violin and Mozart played viola. And then there were 2 other musicians, but they are less important to the story. And a fun thing is that Haydn lent Mozart a copy of a Baroque counterpoint textbook that he had heavily annotated just for fun, not that Mozart needed any more mentoring in music. And Mozart would affectionately address Haydn as Papa. And he actually used the less formal du form of speech in German, which would have been really unusual just considering the age gap between the 2 men. And then in 1785, having already admired Haydn for years and considering Haydn his teacher, Mozart dedicated his last 6 string quartets to Haydn, and they are called the Haydn quartets. And these actual quartets show a really mature capacity to absorb the essence of Haydn's techniques of pervasive thematic development. And they actually display a really substantial equality between the four instruments within the quartets. And then a final thing that should be noted about these Haydn quartets is that it was really unusual for Mozart to dedicate the quartets to another composer. Usually compositions would have been dedicated to a wealthy patron or sponsor of the work, but it's actually a measure of Mozart's deep regard for his friend and mentor that he chose to dedicate these works to Haydn instead.
Haydn's The Creation was an oratorio written between 1797 and 1798. Inspired by Handel's Messiah in Israel and Egypt, it is considered to be Haydn's greatest masterpiece. The first of the oratorio's three parts begins with a prelude that uses stark chords and shifting harmonies to portray how formless the world was prior to the creation. The 6 days of creation are represented in the second part, with each day and each new creation, whether it be light, water, landscapes, plants, and animals, are all depicted with luscious tone painting. The story of Adam and Eve begins in the third part. The oratorio focuses on the joyful union of Adam and Eve, resulting in a beautiful marriage duet.
So the next song we're going to look at is Symphony Number 94 in G major. Haydn composed this in 1791 when he was in London, and it is played primarily in a moderately slow tempo or andante, but it does contain the surprise fortissimo or very loudly chord, which gives the symphony its nickname. The loud chord occurs among very soft dynamics, and it seems out of place within the melody, but Haydn was actually known to include musical jokes into his music, and this is a really good example of that. And then, so we also should note that his articulation and dynamic markings in his actual sheet music are really frequent and specific, which can be explained by him now working in London, where his musicians didn't actually know his musical intentions or style. So he felt it really necessary to make sure that everything that he put in the music, all of his directions were explicit as he could be about them. So his original sheet music for the musicians is covered in page markings. And then for the surprise in the second movement, most historians think that Haydn was upset at people falling asleep in concerts, and they thought that he wanted to include the loud chord in the symphony as a joke to wake everyone up. But what we've now learned is that this is probably not true, and he wanted to add this exciting element because he was competing for attention with his former student, Ignaz Pleyel. So a Haydn biographer, George August Griesinger, asked Haydn if the surprise was meant to wake the audience up, and he responded, "No, but I was interested in surprising the public with something new and making a brilliant debut, so that my student Pleyel, who was at the time engaged by an orchestra in London, and whose concert had opened a week before mine, should not outdo me. The first allegro of my symphony had already met with countless bravos, but the enthusiasm reached its high peak at the andante with the drum stroke encore, encore, sounded in every throat, and Pleyel himself complimented me on my idea." So we're going to listen to just the second movement and listen and wait for that big surprise moment, which makes this piece so famous.
All right. So Haydn wrote this piece in 1776, and it resembles a sonata, but was created for entertainment purposes. And we see throughout this piece there are four different movement shifts from allegro to minuet to andante and back to allegro. And this is a really important piece because it displays some of his techniques talked about before, such as multi-stage variants and double variation. And it was a platform, an example for later composers to base on. And it was a very complex with a bunch of different notes with offbeat patterns and time signature that changes each movement. And the theme varied 5 different times throughout. And this hymn was specifically important because it displayed Haydn's multi-stage variance technique throughout, which was later used and seen in Beethoven's famous piece, Symphony No. 5 in C minor, which was his legendary and famous performance that was based off of Haydn's multi-stage variance technique.
And finally, a future performance that we would recommend that people go see is Mozart and His Mentor. It's put on by the California Symphony, and it is going to be on November 16th, which is a Saturday at 8 p.m., and Sunday, November 17th at 4 p.m. at the Lesher Center for the Arts in Walnut Creek. So this symphony, the program is going to feature Mozart's very first symphony, which he wrote at 8 years old, and Haydn's Final Symphony, which was written when Haydn was 63. And we all think that it would be a really cool way to experience both composers' music in a live setting, because it's not really something that you ever get a chance to see. And tickets are $42 for adults, but $20 for students 25 and under who have a valid student ID. So we would really recommend that you go see it because I think it would be a really cool once in a lifetime experience.